And as you notice, the department is really interdisciplinary, and there are faculty focusing on different aspects of the various environmental topics and subjects and issues. And so out of that department, Michael is known as the expert on environmental justice. So welcome, Michael.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Well, thank you. I know it's kind of late in the afternoon, and it's that time when you're like, you need a coffee or a piece of chocolate to get you through to the dinner time. So thanks for your attention. As Mio said, I'm a sociologist by training that kind of look at issues of equity and distribution, and I've been particularly interested in water over my career. Before I start, though, I do want to just mention to you that the University of California, Berkeley sits on Ohlone Nation land, and that land is unceded, and that land is important to the Ohlone people and their familial descendants. It's important that we recognize as we learn together that the University of California, Berkeley's community continues to benefit from that land and the taking of that land. And so it's important to recognize the institution's impact. I also think it's important to recognize, as we talk about issues of distribution and equity and justice, that much of the economic progress and development of Berkeley, the state of California, the United States more generally, has resulted from the unpaid labor and forced servitude of people of color, right, including enslaved African labor, discriminatory labor and immigration policies against Indians, Chinese, and Japanese people, to just name a few. What I'm doing here is I'm centering our knowledge of people and the history of land and labor practices that have allowed the U.S. society and the University of California more generally to be what it is today. And I think in reconciling that, we also help to redress those sort of violent histories and legacies of settler colonialism in this country. And I know this is a international audience, and you're all sort of involved in learning to understand your own post-colonial histories or your colonial histories, your settler colonial histories, and how that impacts how you think about environmental resources, how you think about equity and distribution. And so this is just my own story, or the story here. And I know I'm happy to talk about your own histories and stories a little later. So just in terms of what I want to try to accomplish today, and it's a lot, but we'll see how far we get. I want to introduce the subject of environmental justice. I want to historicize that as well in its history and how it came about in the United States, in particular in urban centers in the United States. I want to present some challenges to realizing that the principles of environmental justice, particularly here. I want to advance a kind of another theory that kind of redresses some of the ways in which EJ hasn't been achieved in this country in particular. And then I also want to introduce a notion of global environmental justice studies. This idea that, EJ kind of germinated in the United States, but it's been used, and the concept has been stretched to understand the global political economy and injustices that occur in the world system more generally, and how useful it is to stretch this term and how efficacious it can be in understanding inequalities more generally. Just a little bit about me. Color doesn't really look great on these things, but anyway, for most of my career, questions concerning access to water and other resources for Black, Indigenous, and other peoples of color populations and environmental justice has dominated my research career and my writing agenda. I argue in most of my books, it's the same argument over and over again, and that is really that contemporary neoliberal strategies to manage and control water access, both by state and non-governmental organizations, are fundamental in making environmental injustices for people of color around the world. My first book, Where the Waters Divide, looked at neoliberal policies in the province of Ontario, Canada, and its impact on First Nations communities. The second book, New Humanitarianism, was a case study of water nonprofits and how they provided access to communities in Uganda, in Rwanda, and North and South India, and the conditions with which people were getting humanitarian aid. I wrote a textbook on environmental justice, looking at how to teach some of the concepts to undergraduates. And most recently, I just published a book on the Flint water crises and the Detroit water shutoffs, major environmental problems in this country around access to water and the poisoning of communities, predominantly communities of color, through state policy. All right. Thematically, I look at water access, predominantly BIPOC communities, and environmental justice and the role the state plays, but also the role that non-governmental organizations play. And I will say, feel free to kind of just stop me anytime if I feel like there's questions that sometimes I'll say things that I take for granted and it may not be the case. So feel free to just jump in when you need to. So for me, the notion of environmental justice is a framework for understanding, right? And we see this framework being used and again stretched to understand particular types of problems. So we talk about environmental justice more generally, but increasingly we're talking about issues around climate and whether there's climate or injustices in how we think about climate or how we respond, say through the state policies around things like heat sinks and other things. There's issues around housing justice and energy justice. So this is a kind of a framework for thinking about social relations and distributions of environmental goods and services. So when folks in, let's say, Flint, and let me just stop here and ask for, when I say the Flint water crisis, has people heard of that case? The Flint, Michigan water crisis. So a lot of you don't. No, that's okay. So let's see. Okay, that's fine. So it's a framework for understanding, right? And more sort of a deeper way of thinking about environmental justice, or EJ, is a theoretical and it's a methodological approach, right? To examining the uneven ways in which pollution, toxic waste, landfills, right? Uneven development, environmental hazards are distributed among particular social groups, communities, right? And regions, locally and globally. Right. Yeah?
So it wouldn't include questions of access rights?
It would include that, sure. Yeah.
Like access to, because it says pollution, hazards,
yeah.
It's not talking about, okay, access to clean water or...
Yeah, so good question, right? So the theoretical framework is really about pollution, exposure, right? That's where it kind of comes from. It comes, and I'm going to explain it comes out of the sort of toxic waste campaigns, anti-toxic campaigns in the 1960s. My work, right, and others' work, really is about access to water, right? So that's how I'm sort of stretching that framework to include things like access, affordability when it comes to water, right? Quality when it comes to water access as well. So, okay. Good question. Thank you. What happened there? Oh, I pushed something. Okay. There you go. So in the U.S. context, the United States Environmental Protection Agency actually has a definition for what EJ is, right? And they say it's a fair treatment and meaningful involvement. So it's just not exposure. It's also that communities should be involved in decisions, governmental decisions around access, around pollution, around exposure, right? So it's the equal involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, income, with respect to the development, the implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Right? So that is not a law but it's a guideline through which the EPA, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and other state and federal agencies enact certain policies, right? They should be consistent with environmental justice, the fair treatment of people, meaningful involvement, right? Regardless of who you are. Right? A specific part of environmental justice is the notion of environmental racism, right? Because you can think about justice in terms of age, in terms of income, in terms of region, but you can also think about it in terms of race alone, right? Environmental racism, right, is the deliberate targeting, right, of communities of color for toxic waste facilities, the official sanctioning of poisons and pollutions in minority communities, and the systematic exclusion of people of color from leadership roles and decision-making regarding the production of environmental conditions that affect their daily lives. It's an official definition again. What I want to do here, right, is trace out the history of environmental justice, right, from civil rights to kind of what we refer to now as sort of the Black Lives Matter movement. I want to make one thing very clear, that the environmental justice theory and methodology and movement more generally is one that has been directed, it's one that has been pushed by grassroots movements, right? It's always grassroots communities that are pushing federal, state, and local policymakers, right, to put in issues of equity, to lift up voices that are being marginalized, to get voice in places of power. So it's always, I want to make sure I impress upon you that the EJ movement in this country and around the world, right, is an activist-based, some people call it a radical, right? A lot of people, when you hear in the news about Black Lives Matter, people will call it a radical movement. But it is this movement that is based on experience, it's based in community, right, that speaks truth to power. Right? And so I want to talk a little bit about the history of that in this country in particular. Right? So a lot of this starts with the U.S. civil rights movement. Right? And I'm sorry that this is so U.S. based, but this is kind of, I do want to talk a little bit about the history of the movement. So the U.S. civil rights movement waged an assault on various forms of structural racism, right, that impacted in particular African Americans in this country, but other people of color as well, right? And that was multidimensional, right? They were discriminated based on voting rights, on housing rights, where they could live, on education, access to education, on employment, right? Transportation, equal access to other public accommodations. It was legal in this country, right, to not allow people of color to have access to swimming pools, bathrooms, education, drinking water fountains, right? It was housing, it was legal to do that up until the civil rights movement. Right? The other thing I want to mention in terms of activism is that when people took to the streets, they were young and old, right? So the EJ movement is a multi-generational movement, right? They risked their lives. They were beaten, they were hosed with water cannons, they were attacked with vicious dogs, right? Harassed, they were jailed, and some were killed, right, in a quest for equal treatment. Right? Yet they persisted in this intergenerational quest for justice. They waged a war, right, against power on many fronts. They fought for judicial and legislative rights. They fought for rights to income, employment, housing, education, access to public accommodations, and the environment. Right? One of the things that many of you probably know, that Martin Luther King was assassinated. He was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. Right? right? He was, in many ways, the voice or the leadership of the civil rights movement in the United States. He was down in Tennessee because there was a sanitation strike. Okay? Sanitation workers in the U.S. historically have been African American. They were ununionized, they were paid poorly, and many of them, and it was a risky occupation. And MLK went down to Memphis to support the striking folks in Memphis and was assassinated during that time. The point is not just to bring out the assassination, but to bring out the fact that what the EJ movement is bringing together, right, inequalities in the workplace, with inequalities in the home, with inequalities in the air and the water. So they're bringing this together, right, to show how certain groups of people are disproportionately impacted by government policies. Around the same time, right, slightly a little bit later, Rachel Carlson writes what is probably a profound book called Silent Spring. Right? It's in 1962, so a year or two before MLK gets assassinated. And she writes in that book. So she's a biologist, she's an ecologist, and a writer. So she's an ecologist, a woman, female ecologist, right, in the 60s. So she is a very unique, probably alienated person in the academy. But she writes in the book, for the first time in the history of the world, every human being is now subjected to contact with dangerous chemicals, right, from the moment of conception to death. Right? And there was tremendous pushback by the petrochemical industry and industry more generally, pharmaceutical industry, against her work. Right? But she, with help, builds this anti-toxic campaign movement. And it's kind of the coming together of recognizing generally, hey, there are toxins in our air, there are toxins in our soil, there are toxins in our water, and it's in our bodies from the time we are born to the time we pass. And those toxins are not equally distributed in everyone's bodies. That some people's bodies have more toxins than others, and it's only because of who they are. Right? Powerful, powerful moments in history. Please, again, stop me if you have any questions. I want to point to a couple moments in the U.S. Again, it's in the U.S., but around particularly moments in the history of EJ movements that really moved and brought to the public attention the efforts of grassroots people. So here in 1978, this is a unique case just outside of Houston. It's in the suburbs of Houston. And this is a suburban, black, middle-class community, right, called Whispering Pines. And the state of Houston decides it wants to put a landfill in there in 1978. This was the first environmental legal case that was put together by environmental activists in this country, Bob Bullard, in 1979. So in 1979, it's the first environmental justice legal case to put forth towards the court. And research found that, in this case, that communities of color were being actually selected, right, to put waste in their backyards. The research that came out of this study, or out of this proposed landfill that communities were doing, found a really disturbing phenomenon. Right, they found that in Houston, right, black communities were being dumped on. That all five of the Houston-owned landfills were located in black neighborhoods. 6 out of the 8 city-owned incinerators were located in black neighborhoods. 3 out of 4 privately owned landfills were also located in black neighborhoods. So you've got Houston, you've got city-owned, private industry are all dumping, right, in African American neighborhoods. Over 82% of the waste disposal in Houston went to mostly black neighborhoods, regardless of class. even though blacks only made up 25% of the city's population, right?
What percent of the population?
25, right? Yeah, really disturbing, right? Another real, so, you know, here we're sort of, activists are getting in the way, activists are starting to talk, activists are putting data together, right? For many people, what happens in 1982, they argue is really the kind of, in Warren County, North Carolina, is really the kind of the birthplace of the environmental justice movement here. Here's a picture taken by environmental justice scholar Bob Bullard. These are high school kids lying in the front of trucks that are bringing PCB, right, polychlorinated biphenyl into their neighborhood, right? And this is, you know, this community again was kind of selected, right? Because they were rural, they were poor, and they were mostly black, right? Where are we going to put this stuff? We're going to put it in these rural, poor, black communities, right? And they were like, no, we're starting to develop, you know, a movement here. We're starting to understand what this means to us, and we're going to put ourselves in front of these trucks and prevent you from coming into our neighborhood. Right? You're not going to drop these PCB stuff in here. And this is the first time people are actually arrested in this country, right, for standing up for people's environmental rights. So about 500 demonstrators were arrested for protesting the PCB landfill. It's just another picture, right, of portraying the protests that were going on against dumping in Warren County. But you can get a sense of, you know, the police here arresting protesters. But this is young and old, right? These are kids protesting against PCB being dropped. The church, right, which is integral to EJ communities, are front and foremost in the protests against these PCBs. And again, these are leaders in the community up against, you know, what I call the face of the state. So these moments in U.S. history that really galvanized this movement, right, and anti-toxic movement as well. Yeah, please.
Perhaps around that time that there's also mining in Indonesia, as maybe you are really familiar with, in Papua. Which American company really involved and operated, and now it's currently happening until 2040 something, and it took like maybe like 90% gold of Indonesia giving to US.
Yeah.
Like we can say that. But what do you think about that perspective? Because in some way there's like also, I don't know what's going on with me, but
no. Well, I'll try to help. It's extractive and it's harmful and it's devastating to communities, right? And that's the point. And it is emotional. Right? When I write about these things, it is emotional. And the scale matters, right? So I think what I would say is scale matters. So here we're talking about something that goes on in Warren County, but it goes on globally, right? Where resources are, yeah, at the same time, right? Multi-scalar, intergenerational, and it is going on around the globe. And I'll talk a little bit about global EJ. But where resources are being extracted and pollution for the benefit of one group, to privilege one group, in the core countries, where the waste is deposited in the periphery or in Indonesia, and that's a form of inequality, right, as well.
Yeah, I mean, what I want to ask, like, how could like environmental justice work in that area? That maybe in many places like Africa and Asia, but also like in the case of Indonesia, like how could like the industry from another country really run for a long term over generation extraction process? I don't know, like maybe there's a wrong thing in my country's regulation, but is there any like thing that maybe in the U.S. Government to like handle the industry at some level?
I mean, there's a lot. International resource extraction is difficult, in part because legislation, you can commit environmental crimes in one country that are not environmental crimes in your own country. Right? But Indonesia actually has had a strong environmental, in the past, has had strong environmental legislation. So there's a case where, I think it's Indonesia, took Bata shoes to court, the executives, a long time ago, like 40, 50 years ago, in part because they had committed environmental crimes. It's the only country to have taken executives to criminal court that I know of. But neoliberalism and the relaxing of environmental laws and regulations globally, and the influence of corporate power, particularly at the core, has decimated the ability for local nations that are being mined, excessively mined, to actually put in environmental regulations. So stronger international laws, stronger international movements. So you are seeing that, like Via Campesina, these movements for food justice across nation borders. There are other sorts of mining movements globally that are going on that raise this issue, right? So that's a place, I think, that's fertile ground to start that conversation. In addition to protests that are going on, right, there's a body of evidence that starts to, and this is always the case with EJ, right? Community folks are complaining, are active, they're standing up and saying this is wrong, and governments and scientific enterprises will say, well, we don't have the data. But a few months later, a few years later, all of a sudden the data starts to go, hey, you know, those folks were right. And this is kind of the pattern that happens here. In 1983, for example, 1 year after Warren County, after the Warren County protests, the U.S. General Accounting Office conducted a study of several southern states, right, and found that a disproportionate amount of landfills, 3 out of every 4, right, were located near predominantly minority communities. So now the federal government's going, we now recognize what community folks are saying. In 1987, a national study, this is the first time, 1987, it's the first time that a national study is done on toxic waste in the United States. At the time, I think there were 413 toxic waste sites, and the authors of this went around and plotted those sites. This is before GIS, right? This is before modern technology, so you can imagine this was very difficult work to do. It was sponsored by the United Church of Christ Commission on Racial Justice. It was groundbreaking at the time, and it had some amazing findings. It found that 3 out of 5 African Americans and Hispanic Americans lived in communities with 1 or more controlled toxic waste site. 50% of Asian Pacific Islander Americans and Native Americans lived in the same communities. Right? This is a national study, right? This is in the United States. They found that race, and this is important, that race is a predictor of where toxic waste sites are located in this country. Yeah?
Race is a predictor, but is there also a correlation with household income?
Class, yeah. So a lot of people, good question, right? And there's a bit more data I'll show you in a couple slides. There is a correlation, and of course they're integrated, right? But when they did this work and they took out household income, household value, education. When they pulled those out, race was still the predictor. So it's a stronger predictor than income. And I've done some work in more recent census data analysis that kind of look at the integration of those two things. But it's important to recognize that that's one of the debates. Is it race or is it class? And you know, this longitudinal work shows that race is a predictor in this country. A follow-up study was done in 1994, and it actually concluded that this trend had worsened. So there's an interesting contradiction, right, where communities are communities are rising up, there's a movement going on, government is now aware, but things are getting worse in these communities, right? 1990, sociologist Robert Bullard, who's done a lot of this work that I put up here, published a new book, or at that time, called Dumping in Dixie. Dixie is a colloquium for the South of the United States. Dumping in Dixie, Race, Class, and the Environment. This is the first major study of environmental racism that links hazardous facility sightings with historic patterns of segregation in the United States. The South historically was the area of slavery in the United States. So there's a historical pattern where you have slavery, segregation, environmental justice, all in the South, right? Predominantly in the South. It's also the first book that really looks at the social and psychological impacts, right, of living in these despoiled or living with toxic waste exposure in your neighborhoods. I want to go through this a little quicker. So we have some data. Communities are now getting together. In 1991 is an important moment in EJ history where, you know, you've got grassroots activism, you've got communities who come together at a summit. It's the first National People of Color Environmental Justice Summit in 1991. It's an important time where alliances and coalitions are built. This is international. It's also an important time to kind of think about how to explain what is going on in people's communities, because EJ is around, but it's not really a concept that we all say understand when we talk about it. Also, this is also about how to define and talk about these issues amongst different communities who are impacted very differently, right, through segregation and discrimination. So 1991 is important. They come up with 17 principles for environmental justice. As a result, something happens, right, in 1992 and in 1994. All of this push from the grassroots, all of this push from communities really forces the hand of the federal government in the United States. George Bush Sr. puts the Office of Environmental Justice, Office of Environmental Justice within the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. So now there's a separate office that occurs in 1992. In 1994, President Clinton signs Executive Order 12898. There's a couple of sociologists in the White House. That doesn't happen very often. Bob Bullard's up there, and so is Beverly Wright. And they argue that each federal agency shall make achieving environmental justice part of its mission, right? It's an executive order. Yeah, go for it.
Do you think, how strong is the correlation? 1992 was also the year of the first Earth Summit, Korea Summit.
Yeah.
So that was international.
Groundswelling. Yeah. It's all about recognizing. It's all about and some level it's all about the legitimacy of the state. If this is going on globally, if this is going on in local communities, the state has to respond in some way, right? Or you could say, well, the state's just doing what it should be doing. But there's a bit of, it's much more complicated than that. Okay, I wanted to follow up. I'm sorry, this is so small, but there's a follow-up study done to the 1987 study on toxic waste and race. So here's the 1990, right, data, and here's the 2000 data from census tract. So so you can see here, a host site is a site that has a toxic waste site located 3 kilometers. So if you live within 3 kilometers, you're classified as host. If you live outside of that, it's non-host, and there's a reason. If you live 3 kilometers next to a toxic waste site, there's real health, public health research shows that there are real health concerns. So in 1990, 46% of people who lived in a host site were people of color. In 2000, that went up to 55.9, right? And the split is for African Americans, it stays at 20 and 20. For Hispanic Latino, it goes from 20 to 27. So you can see where the increase is in particular. But you get a sense of the longitudinal study and where it's located. But the issue really for me, and the problem for me, is more legislation, potentially more legislation, more awareness, and we see increasing, right, concentration of race and toxic facilities in this country. How do I explain that? I kind of explain it through a couple reasons. One is the election of George Bush Jr. Under his administration, the EPA changed its focus. Many policy research centers were canceled. He really slashed the budget tremendously. I think at least a third at the time of the EPA, which made their work of doing environmental justice almost impossible. There was a legal case in the Supreme Court, Alexander versus Samadol. Up until then, environmental justice activists were using Title VI of the Civil Rights Code to hold corporations accountable, and all they had to do at the legal level was say to prove exposure, to prove impact. This case changed that at the Supreme Court. They said you didn't only have to prove impact, you had to prove intent. You had to prove that the corporation, the industry, the facility intended to pollute you, right? Which really made Title VI of the Civil Rights Code impossible to enforce. Right? It's really impossible to prove intent in the court beyond a reasonable doubt. The other thing he did was a lot of the money used for civil cases, criminal cases from the EPA was funded through a tax levied on the petrochemical industry. That expired in 1995 and it zeroed out in 2003, and he did not renew it. So the EPA really lost its legal budget to go to court against corporations. I did a follow-up work, and this time we used a little bit of GIS and Python in terms of just looking at the more recent census data. And so this is 2010, and so you can see that this number increased again. So it went up to 57% in the 2010 census tract. But you'll also notice that the poverty rate went up. So those same people, there's more people of color, but those people of color are poorer than they were a decade ago. And that reason, of course, is what we would call the Great Recession, right? Where people, the subprime housing crisis that affected many core countries, in particular many people over the world, impacted people disproportionately. And so the issue around EJ is, if you're more impacted but you're poor, it's harder to make life choices. It's harder to leave. It's harder to get out of those or get away from those toxic environments. Of course, the Trump EPA really put the brakes on EJ in this country. I'd go so far to say he probably put the brakes on EJ globally. He infamously said environmental protection was a joke. He cut the budget by billions. He put Scott Pruitt in charge as the administrator, a well-known lobbyist, an advocate. As the Attorney General for the state of Oklahoma, he sued the EPA 14 times. It's hard to believe that this actually happened. Scott Pruitt was so bad in office he had to leave. They put in Andrea Wheeler and you can see what his palmares is. So they basically put in folks who were going to stymie the EPA's mission. They reduced some of the standards, contaminating drinking water, which was really harmful for really a lot of industrial communities, post-industrial Rust Belt communities in this country. Many activists, scholars, are really struggling with the lack of EJ realization in this country and around the globe. Some folks have said, we're not really thinking about the role of government, the role of the state, because the role of the state is they are involved in creating some of these inequalities. We're not thinking about the role of corporations in a deep enough way, right? We're not thinking about entrenched power. And so a lot of scholars in particular have moved the radar a little bit on EJ and that framework, and are talking about a critical environmental justice framework, right? So we want to really expand the range of social categories under investigation. And they do so in multiple ways. So they use multiple categories of difference, right? And their intersections, right? So we talked about race and income, right? We're talking about global extractive processes at multiple scales, right? So we're not just talking about facilities in small communities. We're trying to expand what we think about when we talk about injustices and their root causes. We're talking about questions of multi-scalar, right? Again, really centering the state as an active participant in creating these injustices. In the past, environmental justice framework or environmental justice movement was really about quantifying disproportionality. So communities would do their homework, they would quantify disproportionality in their community, they would then lobby government to put in more equal laws. Right? That was the kind of the goal. But when the state's poisoning you, or when the state's allowing you to dig out mines and extract resources, who does one turn to, right? So the role of the state needs to be really, really involved, and this is the role of sort of critical environmental justice. The other interesting piece to critical EJ is this notion of expendability and indispensability. And expendability is that this notion that extractive processes target certain groups of people, certain regions, as expendable, right? And we need to acknowledge that. The other flip side of that is those communities are the first people to respond, are the first people to be aware of how those extractive processes are impacting them. And so therefore they are indispensable, right, in environmental justice movement, right? So this idea of expendability and indispensability. The last thing I want to talk about is this idea of global environmental justice studies. It emphasizes the transnational flow of capital, of people, and waste. It really presets a non-US or Western-centric framing of EJ. Right? So it's not about the civil rights movement, it's not about the US, right? It's thinking about this in terms of struggles that occur around the world, right? Not just in the core. It's about thinking about EJ as an assemblage of different actors and networks that are professional, that are highly profitable, and are highly powerful, right? They can stop governments from, let's say, putting in environmental legislation. And it highlights recent technology and policy interventions to address a range of environmental justice issues. Right? Thinking about finance, thinking about green energy and carbon markets. These are innovative technological efforts, but also, right, there are huge inequalities and disproportionalities that result out of global finance restructuring, that result in carbon markets, that result in green energy infrastructure around the world. A couple examples of that here, right, is a transnational flow of capital, right, employs a world systems approach to understand the relationship between the core and the periphery. And this is exactly your question, right? Here you see, a kid in Ghana sorting through e-waste, right, for industry that was produced and benefited folks of Western consumption. And we need to tie these things together more closely. Again, it presents a non-Western perspective, right, or centric framing of EJ, to talk about different struggles that have justice at their root, but may not, right, emerge out of the civil rights or anti-toxic campaigns in this country. In Myanmar, government efforts to push large dam projects, for example, have been met with a flood of resistance. La Via Campesina, international peasants movement in India, have really pushed how we think about extractive crops like oil, like coconut. In Colombia, millions are forced to migrate due to conflicts and threats from mining firms as well. So we want to be able to tie these things together. Think about who are the actors involved in this. And again, thinking about developments or thinking about technological policies. And here's a couple of examples of that. You know, here we have Wall Street companies, hedge fund companies buying up land in the West, but they're not buying up land to live on. They're not buying up land even to farm. They're buying up land for water futures, right? And so here's a way in which people who might want to live in these places or might want to have access to water will not in the future, because of the way in which financial markets are starting to look at resources in the future. Right? Not to something to distribute, but to something to invest in and to leverage. And again, you know, we've got these claims around the green economy. Colombia, for example, has 2 dams on the Upper Magdalena River. There are efforts to put in 11 dams. And the guise of that is the green economy. This is a clean fuel, hydroelectric power. Of course, that is going to displace hundreds of thousands of peasants, farmers who live in this area, who use this area for sustainability or sustainable development. Again, so another way of thinking about how things like the green economy result in environmental justices down the road. So I'm gonna stop there, and this is just an article from an article in Politico, a response to Biden's climate compromise. Many environmental justice groups didn't sign on to this because of the nature of how it was framed, how environmental justice was framed. Many environmental justice groups felt like they were left out of solutions and weren't really included in the climate-related incentives. So, just to conclude, we talked a little bit about the definition of what EJ is. We talked about the history of that in the United States in particular, its movement, the challenges of realizing that in this country and elsewhere. I touched on critical environmental justice as a way to expand sort of the way in which we might think about the movement and thinking about inequality more generally. I also touched a little bit on the notion of global environmental justice studies and how we might think about EJ around the globe. I'm going to stop there and take any questions. Thank you. You're always an intimidating audience because you have so much expertise in your own countries and stuff like that. So yes?
2 questions, which I'm happy to give you one or none.
Sure.
First is you began with the definition of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency of environmental justice, and it's global. Are there any global definitions or frameworks on environmental justice? And second question is, in designing climate adaptation or mitigation programs, are there methodologies or screens that you suggest to assess ensuring environmental justice?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in the first one, you know, I would look to, in terms of templates or frameworks, the principles in 1991. And then I'd actually, those 4 points that I just went over in critical environmental justice, those are actually really important ones. Thinking about scale, if you want to look at scale, intersectionality is one word I didn't use, indispensability, expendability, those 4 points. And I can leave the slide, so if you just as a refresher, I think that's another template to think about in advancing EJ. I'm gonna say that, you know, there is the EPA's EJ toolkit that does have, I know, so here I'm going to the state, going back to the state after I've told you to be mindful of the state, but I think there are people who are on WEJAC, the White House Environmental Justice Committee, that actually work at Berkeley. There are other people on the National Environmental Justice Committee that are pushing the state to build a toolkit for communities to use. So if you look at the EPA's website, if you look at the Office of Environmental Justice, you'll see those toolkits, and they are actually quite useful. So that was where I'd go. Yes?
In the context of technological and industrial development, can we consider the 3 Mile accident in 1975 as part of the history of EJ?
Could you say that again? I'm sorry, I didn't catch it. Just the last part.
The 3 Mile Island
The 3 Mile,
accident in
Yep.
Pennsylvania in 1979. Can we consider that part of the history of the EJ in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, 3 Mile Island's a nuclear reactor, right? That's a nuclear reactor explosion in Buffalo? Is it Buffalo? Upstate New York?
In Pennsylvania.
Is it Pennsylvania? Thank you. And I'm hesitating because I don't know the answer to that question. Like I think I'd have to look at who lives near the reactors and how they were built and how they were zoned and who lives next door to them. So I don't want to say yes it is, but I think, you know, it's certainly an environmental disaster in the U.S. It certainly impacted people who lived near that area. I would say the Hooker Chemical incident, right? I think that was a little different, but that occurred from the dumping of Hooker Chemicals in a community that then became a school. That would be more of, I think that, you know, the history shows that would be an EJ.
I remember said there were protesters during that time.
Yeah. So, I'm not that familiar with the case. It's been a while, but I think, so again, it's like, my sense is it probably is, but I don't feel totally comfortable answering that question because I don't have the data in front of me. You're welcome. Yeah.
You ended by saying how environmental justice movements in the United States felt left out of Biden's climate solutions. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah.
The presenter earlier this week was talking about the Justice 40.
Yeah, I think, part of what's a concern about Biden's plan is the use of the market as a vector for bringing in justice, right? And so the market's a great thing. I'm not totally anti-economics, but the market provides goods and services to customers or consumers. And so a lot of people who are impacted by unaffordable housing, water, school, and other access to other environments, they're not able to consume those to begin with, right? The other thing about the Biden plan is it doesn't take into account historically racialized segregation in the EJ that have happened before. So there's no equity, right? It's like, okay, it's more a plan around equality. And EJ is really about equity at its root. Like, these people have been disproportionately harmed historically historically, and so we want to make sure that they are having the same access to schools, food, water, transportation, all those things, and that's about equity. And that plan doesn't really deal with equity in a meaningful way. So that, I think, is part of the problem that a lot of EJ groups will have. The larger EJ groups that are professionalized, that are well integrated into the state, I think they would say that this is a good program. Like, we are able to take government money, we're able to plant trees in certain areas, we're able to do this in other areas, we're able to electrify certain systems, electric cars more affordable. There's federal discounts on them, right? But that's not really addressing a lot of the historical concerns that EJ communities have. The other thing about the Biden administration plan is that at the same time as providing all of those EJ incentives through market-based structures, it also allows for drilling and other things to go on at the same time. So it's kind of this compromise between, EJ communities that have a voice in Washington and petrochemical lobbyists that still want to drill in Alaska and elsewhere. And so the administration has tried to compromise that, and a lot of EJ communities that are small feel like they never got a voice in that bill. Any other questions? Okay, go for it. Go for it.
One last question.
Oh, I didn't see it back. Okay, I was. Was that you? Mio, was that you? I'll go with you, Mariela.
Yes. Okay. We already have this environmental justice as a previous idea, and we built the climate justice idea based on this. Okay. So now, as you was talking about racism, but also I don't know, a level of income or age, I will say young people. And we have a lot of movements right now, right?
Yeah.
Greta Thunberg, you already know.
Yeah.
So my question is, how can we deal with this real justice in climate? I mean, everybody needs, you know, and deserves a weather with, a healthy weather. I mean, it's impossible to live like this. And I completely understand young people, and my generation, we just don't talk about that kind of things, okay? We talk about environmental justice. Now it's climate. There are going to be another movements because we don't know what is going to happen. It's a part of the uncertainty. So, what is your opinion about, taking care of next generations and keeping the voice of that young people that deserves a good...
A lot of EJ communities that I work with all have youth training, all of them. And so that is part of and whether it's indigenous communities or African American communities, right, they're always training, and they're always about educating the youth, and that is important, right? They cut their teeth on community events. I'm working with folks in Oakland that are bringing this into grade 3s and 4s into the curriculum, right? So they're training kids, and it's like you don't have to really teach them that much because they can actually see what's going on around them, right? They can see that they don't have trees, that their playground is tarmac, that their books are old. They understand that. What communities are doing is giving them the tools to articulate that. And the other thing I would say is that it's important to recognize the solidarity between groups, that women fighting for labor rights in Bangladesh have something in solidarity with farmers in Colombia pushing back against the coffee industry, right? These are not competing groups, but they're actually fighting the same person. So, thanks.
Will you give with the example of the market, and the market being an example of why we're here and why there's injustice, and it's not going away anytime soon.
Right.
So what I think about the classic trolley problem, and people have a harder time morally, ethically thinking about a choice of justice when there's action involved.
Right.
Versus inaction is less stressful. But how do you think about the injustice or inequity when you're trying to evaluate what are the costs of inaction, of not working within the existing system? Because I feel like I work in a place where it's Conservation International is one of the largest purveyor of carbon credits. We work within this this system. And we're always talking about like speed and scale and sustainability, but like also speed and how it's not equitable to wait, how the climate crisis is urgent, how this is the decade of action. But I find myself wondering, like, what are the questions we should be asking ourselves about, like what should be the devil's advocate voice in the room about when to slow down?
Yeah, that's a good question. If I had that, I would. No, I'm just kidding. So, you know, a couple of things. I would think, I don't like the notion of inevitability, right? That capitalism is a system that's been with us for 450 years. So is the nation state. And that's not very long in our lifetime. So I'm not going to answer you directly, but I think that in terms of my own political, in terms of my own political activism, there are ways to change that nonprofit sector to become more equitable, to center equity, right, and not profit. And so you might argue, well, then the CEO is going to get fired, and you know we're not get investors. But there's a way in which that can change over time. So you work from what I would say within the belly of the beast, right? At the same time as you do radical politics. So you are helping other groups raise up their intentions. And I think it's that solidarity that speaks to social change. I mean, you think about think about the Arab Spring. You think about the Occupy movement. You think about these La Via Campesina, these global movements where we were so close to fundamentally changing the system, as it were, right? And that's the hope you have, right? That it is changeable. You can change it. So you do two things. You work structurally to change the system, but you work within that structure that's given to you.
I think we're out of
Time.
Unfortunately, Michael will be here for the panel.
Yes, that's right. So I'm not done.
Let's take a quick
Thank you.
break,
Thank you.
and we'll move on